Games are never better tools for learning than when you design the game yourself. Can games play a role in learning? The answer is yes, especially when you consider the two ways of learning with games. Games make you think, and not only about playing the game. When you play, you think. That's when your emotions take over to force your thinking. They align with a goal, the goal of proving what you can accomplish in the game. Playing undoubtedly helps you learn the skills involved in the game. That means that two things are happening. You're learning the rules of the game and you're acquiring the skills associated with the game. Not bad if the game develops skills that prove helpful elsewhere. But what about when you create a game? That's what we can do with the right tools. It's a game experience at a totally different level. When you create a game, something else happens. It includes weighing and understanding everything that the game contains. But it's much more than that. It also means understanding the things you decide not to include in the game. Let's call that perspective. It's like the difference between a framed picture of a landscape and actually being in the landscape. In the first, you can experience what the painter has allowed you to see. In a real landscape, you can look anywhere and see everything that has been excluded from the painter's framing. But you can also go anywhere, touch things, smell them, and even take home a souvenir. In other words, the person who paints the picture you're looking at knows more than what they share with you. They also know why they haven't shared everything with you. The same goes for a game. Creating the game requires dealing with a much wider concept than what the game ultimately contains. So there are two ways of learning. Learning what someone else has seen and interpreted, and learning through seeing and interpreting in a fuller context. Let's call the first restricted learning and the second unlimited learning. In both cases, learning takes place. But to frame the debate a little differently, framing can sometimes be instructive. Let's try another question. Is learning about thinking? More precisely, is restricted learning, the kind we're all used to through academic training, about thinking? Well, sometimes it is, but we can't always be too sure about the relationship between learning and thinking. To understand that relationship, let's make the question a little more complex. Can you learn without thinking? Memorizing, for example, doesn't necessarily require thinking, not much thinking anyway. But let's turn the question around. Can you think without learning? Some will say it depends on what you think about. Daydreaming seems to go nowhere and accomplish nothing. But at the very minimum, even trivial thinking teaches you something about yourself. And when Einstein daydreamed, he began to unravel the mysteries of physics. But somewhere between random daydreaming and Einstein's breakthroughs, there's a middle ground we're all concerned with: the art of making critical choices, like what to have for dinner, who to vote for, or what job to train for. So, does making a critical choice involve thinking? Well, most people would emphatically say, yes, it does. But does it involve learning? Well, games and sports almost always involve making critical choices. For example, with the nanoseconds ticking away, a tennis player decides whether to play a backhand or whether to run around the backhand to hit a forehand with more force and accuracy. When we play a game, we make choices and discover the direct consequences of our choices, good, bad, or mitigated. When there's a context, like two players on a tennis court, we observe the patterns of the other player's behavior and adjust our strategies. The nice thing about games is that if we don't feel comfortable with our performance, we can play the game again and correct our misreadings or mistakes. So, playing games always involves learning, especially if there's variability in the way the opponent behaves. But what about creating a game? There's no need to imagine the rules of tennis, basketball, or Monopoly, or for that matter, Beltway politics if you're a politician in Washington, D.C. Someone has already created those games. Players seek to learn not just the rules, but how to act, often innovatively, within the rules. That is very different from the experience of a game creator, someone who makes the rules and takes responsibility for their coherence. Rules must not be arbitrary. They represent a logical understanding of constraints. Not many learners have been given the opportunity to create a game. That has been an unfortunate fact in the history of education. It's particularly unfortunate when we realize that from the age of 3 or 4, we all have at least rudimentary skills in building the most common game that exists, a conversation. That means we can all be game creators if we put those skills to work, and by putting them to work, refine them. With Chatscaper, a piece of software that respects and visually represents the nonlinear reality common to human decision-making and simple conversations, learners can become the authors of games. But how can learners create a game? Well, every game starts from a context. It can be a problem situation or an unknown opportunity. Chatscaper begins by kicking off a conversation. Learners working with a facilitator or teacher suggest a first set of possible choices that represent real or imaginary strategies or attitudes. They begin to imagine likely developments for every new reply. They think about the interaction and construct the developing logic of each thread. By building to final outcomes, always plural, they create games that other people can play. The game they have created is a finished product. The process of creating it is a project. What goes into producing such a game? Well, imagination, research, thought, logic, judgment and critical thinking, applying principles of design. But perhaps most of all, pride in producing an object other people may learn from and enjoy. And if the game is created collectively, in a group of learners working together, it involves the kind of collaborative skills that will be required in the real world. Chatscaper is a tool that requires learning only one skill, visually plotting out, step by logical step, the non-linear logic of a conversation. When all the content is finalized, it plays back as a multimedia game. Playing the game they've created reminds the creators of what they've learned in creating it. Creating it is a much wider learning experience, something like strolling through a landscape.